Hello, everyone. My name is Haider Pasha. I'm the Chief Security Officer for Palo Alto Networks. I look after Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And it's a pleasure for me to welcome you once again to another conversation in our digital age series that we call Navigating the Digital Age. So we're really excited because this is an opportunity for us to really sit down with some of the experts that are featured in that cyber guide. And I'm extremely excited to welcome on Mike Towers. Mike is the Chief Information Security Officer for Takeda Pharmaceuticals International, and also the author of the chapter, The Path to a Successful Cloud Transformation. Mike, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Look forward to the discussion.
So, Mike, I want to begin, obviously, there's lots of questions here. So what I really want to start with is really the first and probably the most obvious question that I'm sure a lot of people are asking themselves is really around this focus on cloud transformation. So in your specific chapter, you discuss why cloud transformation is essential to modern businesses. Obviously, the last couple of years with COVID have seen almost an influx of new initiatives moving towards the cloud. From your perspective, what are some of the benefits that the cloud brings and that internal resources are struggling to match?
Thanks for the question. It's definitely an area that I did touch upon. I think broadly speaking, for most of us, if we put enough energy and resource and investment, we could theoretically build a lot of capability internally that might be enough to support the business. But I think broadly speaking, there's three areas where I think that internal resources just can't cut it. One is elasticity and the ability to ramp up and ramp down and ramp sideways quickly. Secondly is geographic scale. If you have a global business and you need to support users, business processes, external stakeholders in more than one geography, that's something that cloud provides much more feasible capability to support. And thirdly is a lot of security and compliance capabilities that obviously is near and dear to my heart, but a lot of the controls that you need to add, not only from a protection perspective, but from a compliance perspective, they're much more difficult to replicate internally than they are with the cloud.
Yeah, and generally the way I see it also, Mike, as you have alluded, is that there are a lot of key focus areas that traditionally we have to think about when we move towards the cloud as well. And one of the big challenges is speed and agility. This is generally what I hear from most CISOs and CIOs as well. And that's a key element of why cloud transformation is sort of that next evolution for most businesses. Another question that I have is really around the role of enabling the business. So, again, going back to your article, one of the key elements that we're thinking about is the experience at Takeda itself. So has cloud been a differentiator to the business to help you to stay ahead of the curve? And kind of what are some of your thoughts on that and what experiences can you share with us at Takeda?
Yeah, absolutely. I would go beyond calling it a differentiator and actually calling it a necessity. And I think when you're a company like Takeda, where you operate in over 100 countries and you have multiple therapeutic areas serving multiple different stakeholder groups, and given our global footprint, as I mentioned, and frankly, the extreme growth of data and digital capability, that requires the cloud, and therefore is a differentiator for us to be able to build up, deploy, and frankly, manage ongoing much more feasibly, much more quickly, and much more capably than before.
Yeah. Brilliant. And I think that's generally synonymous with what we hear from kind of most customer experiences that are moving to the cloud. And then what's really interesting is we see organizations that were traditionally cloud reverse or perhaps cloud initially adopted. But now, as a result of the pandemic, we see a lot of these organizations moving towards a cloud-first strategy, and those that were on a cloud-first strategy moving towards a cloud-only strategy as well. Another question really is around the shared responsibility model. Obviously, we can't have a conversation without talking about that. But when I look at businesses, and this is where we love to hear kind of your perspective, obviously at Takeda as well, what would you recommend for other organizations who may not be as far along as much as you are, and how would you recommend that approach from a shared responsibility model around data management? What are some of the key learnings there perhaps for you, and what are some of the elements around that you could share with us?
Well, I think first and foremost is educating the teams and educating the stakeholders that you work with internally, that just because you've decided to partner with a cloud provider doesn't mean you're completely giving up the security decisions and the security responsibility to somebody else. So focusing on the basics and understanding that those risk discussions still need to occur. One size won't fit all. So it's understanding where maybe additional security makes sense and in other areas, frankly, where it may not. And leveraging the economy of scale and the reuse that you can get from a scalable cloud infrastructure to build things like an enterprise data backbone. And I would also recommend that there's a focus of transparency and making sure that even though you are trying to get reuse and build those economies of scale, that you can have the transparency to show who's using what, where there's unique usage and why, and you can react accordingly. But I think broadly speaking, it's understanding that those risk discussions still have to happen. You have to make decisions as the customer. You have to confirm what features that you may or may not want to use, and therefore turn them on and turn them off appropriately and manage their effectiveness moving forward.
Yeah, and the challenge with shared responsibility model is also, in my opinion, a lot of the education factor as well, that I think a lot of businesses generally tend to forget when they initially begin their cloud transformation journey. It's almost sort of teaching ourselves on the value of what we need to protect and what is our asset, even though it's sitting in the cloud. We can't expect the cloud providers to be protecting that. That is still data that's sensitive to our business. And of course, we need to be the sole custodians of securing that specific information itself. One of the things I've heard you touch in the past is really around the role of how the CISO is changing. In the roughly 20 plus years that I've been doing this role, obviously I've seen the evolution of the CISO really change over the course of each of those various different years, and especially I would say in the last maybe 3 to 5 years as well. And where we are today is that focus around business resilience, and for most CISOs, we're kind of morphing ourselves into this chief business resilience officer type role. So unpack that for us a little bit, if you can, please. What do you mean by that when you kind of reference the chief business resilience officer kind of concept in your article?
You can almost argue as we were a typical IT department head. We ran the network, or we ran the servers, and security in some respects was equivalent to that, where we were basically just service owners for, antivirus or firewalls or intrusion detection. But as the business and all business processes have become more fundamentally underpinned by data, digital, and technology, then it's no longer about protecting the traditional IT stack, endpoint security, network security, et cetera. Of course, those building blocks are important. But as CISOs mature and evolve, and as the role matures and evolves, whether we like it or not, we are fundamentally critical to making sure the business can run and the different parts of the business have resilience, because all those digital and technology underpinnings can impact how effective the business operates if their operational stability is impacted, their availability is impacted, the data integrity is impacted. So all of that, I believe, makes the CISO much more of a business resiliency expert, if you will, and frankly, evolving to be as such. And in our case, that would be things like making sure the research and development process is resilient, the manufacturing processes are resilient, and then obviously that we can sell our products and make sure we have post-launch patient care accordingly.
So one of the other things I read in your chapter was that you've been a long-term proponent of cloud adoption. It seems like everyone's doing it now, but that was not always true. In being an early adopter, how do you overcome the perception that on-premise is safe and cloud is not? Certainly, it wasn't just you that had that single meeting and then everybody said, okay, we're off to the races, right? So I'm sure there must have been lots of discussions around the value of not just cybersecurity, but how security should be played versus what you were doing on-prem versus now that you need to do on the cloud. So what are your thoughts around that? And can you share how you guys overcame that sort of perception of on-prem security versus on the cloud?
Well, it's a great question. And I think first and foremost is that as leaders, we have to be willing to have the tough discussion. And a lot of the prospects of the cloud, if you will, at least early days when I was talking about this, as you mentioned quite a few years ago. A lot of the anti-cloud position was either A, lack of understanding, or B, concern about job security, because the more you do internally, obviously the more people you can keep. And of course, no one ever wants to see anybody lose their job, but it's a capability that for many, many companies isn't closely congruent with the business outcomes they're trying to achieve. So fundamentally speaking, as a pharmaceutical company, there are companies out there that can and should be better at hosting data and running a cloud environment, because it's the lifeblood of their company and it's not ours. So congruency with business outcomes is one thing. And I think the other thing that, and you brought it up a little bit, is many times human nature is to assume that the safest thing and the lowest risk thing is to do nothing. In reality, the higher risk option here is actually doing nothing. Because in my perspective, and this is one of the cases that I've been making, every day you're running a highly critical or a highly sensitive or a system with high security requirements on premise, unless you're maybe one of 10 companies in the world that can afford to do everything that needs to be done to make those systems resilient, you're taking more risk, because if it goes down, you'll be able to rebuild it. If it runs out of capacity, you won't be able to add it quickly enough. So the resiliency and scalability advantages that I mentioned before are basically the risks of doing nothing. And it's important to realize that the risk of doing nothing in this regard is not the safest, and it's not the lowest as it would be to actually move.
Yeah, totally agree on that point. And then, again, we kind of talk about these journeys to the cloud, right, Mike? And so something that I've noticed is that the cloud transformation is often positioned as being binary. Majority of the discussions I have is, you're either on the cloud or you're either on-prem. And I don't think that's obviously the case. And I'm sure you'll agree. However, I think we are going to be hybrid, right? And I think that there is a journey there as you move and as you transition services in that hybrid fashion. So talk to us a little bit about the transition period of being hybrid. What is that like, and some recommendations there?
Yes, absolutely. I think that there's a lot of factors there, and it's a great question, because I think it is something that, we're not going to go home on Friday and then come in on Monday and have everything in the cloud. And sometimes I envy some of these younger companies that have been built from the ground up on cloud, because they've never had to deal with that magic L word of legacy. But especially in an organization as conservative and as regulated as biopharmaceuticals, many of us likely have applications that are old enough to build. So depending on how many internal data centers you have, the maturity of your applications, sometimes it doesn't make sense to move an application or to move a workload to the cloud. That would be all you're doing is moving that inefficiency, because frankly, you're going to pay a lot more renting that space when you're only using a tenth of it than you would be on premise. So there's all sorts of, I would say, data center and maturity elements here as well. We've planned for and are in the middle of a 2 to 3 year migration period. Okay. And it's important to understand how processes and operational disciplines must span that time period, especially for things like data interfaces and change control, where it's very, very likely the expectations of the processes in the cloud and on-premise are very different. But from a business perspective, you'll have to navigate and manage both.
Yeah, again, extremely valid points there, Mike. And I guess almost within that concept, I guess it brings us to the next question around change management. I think a lot of organizations assume that what we're doing on premise from a change management perspective is going to be the same in the cloud. And I don't think that's obviously true. And obviously there's certain things that we have to change as we start moving, from on-prem to the cloud. So in your experience, what's different? And how have you planned for a change like that?
Well, mainly speaking, the fundamental difference is the speed expectation and the number of variables that can change. So on premise, there are natural delimiters to what can be changed. Disk space, memory, network interfaces. You have a lot more control of the environment. Some of the advantages I mentioned before about elasticity and flexibility, that comes with frankly, a lot of choice and a lot of options, a lot of knobs to turn. So there's many, many more elements that require change control. And the discipline of change control doesn't go away when you move to the cloud. It's just the variability of the changes that you'll have to think about, and the speed expectations by which they're reviewed and approved are night and day different. So those have to be, I'll use an example where a lot of times you may hear about an internal firewall rule change control process, which, given all of the potential steps and discussions and approval steps, may take as many as 5 to 6 business days internally. There's no way that will fly in the cloud. You're talking about measuring in minutes and hours rather than days for some of these changes, but it doesn't mean you don't have the discipline and requirement to manage those changes properly. So expectation of speed and the variability of the changes that require certain levels of scrutiny is completely different.
Yeah. And I think, again, obviously, overall change management is so critical that, we almost have to sort of take a step back and really think about, what had worked for us on-prem. And we obviously have to make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes, as we do change management in the cloud itself. Now, again, the majority of the discussions I have with CIOs and CISOs like yourselves, when we think about cloud, and you kind of touched on this in the beginning as well, was around kind of speed and agility and, the reasons why cloud transformation is so critical. But I can't help talk about speed and not talk about automation. Can you describe a bit about how the change management piece and sort of the security automation kind of come together in that environment, and kind of share some thoughts around that area?
Well, quite simply, I think automation is the only way to ensure control, consistency, and speed when you're talking about, again, all of these options. And I think when you're talking about this new world, if you will, where things are expected in hours, sometimes minutes even, not days or weeks, some of those important control points you may have had in the past to ensure a security setting is made or ensure a compliance control is embedded. All of that potentially could do some manual checks on premise. In the cloud, automation, again, is fundamental to make sure that that's done consistently across many, many different types of workloads. And automation is the only way that you can do that, again, to meet the speed and scale expectations.
Yeah. And, again, automation is critical, but I think one of the key areas we can't overlook, of course, is the people element itself. You need to have a plan for the human side. And I think it can be really easy to focus on the process and the technology, but kind of maybe underemphasize sort of the people component. So from a skills perspective, and I know this is a very big topic, but really if we hone down primarily from a cloud area, if someone's looking at sort of this multi-year transformation, what are some of the skills and some of the processes that you think are just absolutely critical that an organization needs to develop as they adopt the cloud? And perhaps as a second half of that, perhaps what are some of the things that they really need to start to get in terms of those skills as they begin into that project?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would start with, I've always been a big proponent of being brilliant at the basics. So what is different about hosting in the cloud? What's a container? What's a virtual machine versus a container? What does it mean to be serverless? Some of these basics that you start off with, that it's important that everybody gets a line on. And frankly, it would benefit most companies to have similar taxonomies and similar semantics as well. But I would also think about, some of the processes that I'm pretty sure that business is going to be using to leverage the power of cloud. Things like more of an agile or a scrum approach to ongoing product development, rather than traditional waterfall projects. DevOps skill set, so you're constantly doing cyclical development and operations checks. API security is a big component because a lot of the cloud interaction is through APIs, and it's a different mindset and a different skill required. And I think one of the fundamental, I've heard people say data is the new fuel, if you will. If you're going to build a cloud infrastructure properly, there's going to be a ton of data cataloging that needs to be done. Where are your high-end data sets? How does the data move around? What does an extract, transfer, and a load process look like, an ETL process for all the data that's going to have to be moving from various legacy systems into the cloud or vice versa? So data cataloging and data architecture is an important skill as well.
There's, it's interesting because, again, like yourself, I've been in the industry for so many years. And when I think about skills and I think about skill sets specifically on the cloud, many of the skill sets we're looking for today, frankly, weren't even jobs that were created perhaps 5 or 10 years ago. And so what's really interesting is we're looking for those specific types of skills that perhaps people weren't really truly educated for from a college or university experience level. It's stuff that they've picked up in their overall careers that they're now contributing as well. So it is something that obviously has to evolve. And when I look and fast forward 5-10 years into the future, I also foresee a lot of new jobs and new requirements that we're going to need, obviously for the cloud and to a certain extent on-premise as well, specifically in the cybersecurity space itself. So speaking of which, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges, that you've noted as more and more organizations are moving to the cloud? I mean, they all talk about cybersecurity and, perhaps data residency and some other, areas that are generally a key area. But specifically in your experience, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges, that organizations typically have as they move to the cloud?
Yeah, I think first and foremost is, we have to start preparing for getting past, I think sometimes it's a mental and even an emotional block of the tangibility of protection for something that you don't have direct control over, that you can't put your hands and you can't walk into a data center and hug your server anymore. That not having it tangibly in front of you and therefore ensuring its control, that's something, frankly, that a lot of CISOs are wired to do, that I control it, therefore I can secure it as best. So making the mental leap from control, beginning to end, to facilitation. What does it mean to have a third-party partner steward your data for you? You obviously have to build a level of trust in your external partnerships because, again, you're giving somebody else in many respects direct stewardship over your data. As I said before, they're better at it than you are going to be, but it still requires a strong partnership to do that. And the other thing I would say is, in the cloud, things tend to grow and change quite quickly. And frankly, you're enabling the business to move much more quickly. So you may not be able to make the traditional, I'll say, control choices that you made in the past, or restrictions maybe that you were in the past. So focusing on governance and visibility and full transparency before you make control decisions is important. And the last thing I would say is kind of like related to what we talked about before. Don't automatically assume that you can train all of your people to be cloud experts and forget about the legacy. And you're going to be in this bubble period where you're going to be accountable and expected to protect data in the cloud as well as data on-prem at the same time for a while, knowing that the processes and expectations are different and the controls are different. So you can't assume that it's going to be one or the other. It's going to be both for quite a while. And that does stretch the staff from a capabilities perspective and a cycles perspective that has to be planned for.
Yeah. And the focus really is when we think about cybersecurity, unfortunately, again, from my experience, especially in the last 2 years, there's so many organizations that rush to the cloud because we had remote workers, remote DevOps engineers, remote resources perhaps, or supply chain partners now that were stuck in lockdowns but still needed to get their business up and running. And what we really didn't perhaps oversee as well as we should have was the cybersecurity component. We rushed to the cloud, and cybersecurity kind of took a back step. And now, as you said, is the key focus is to make sure that cybersecurity is a critical element, and that we're focused on ensuring and understanding what the key challenges are, and moving forward, of course, are looking at the right controls from a cybersecurity perspective on the cloud itself. Another very common topic is really around metrics. We always talk about how important bringing in the ROI for that cloud transformation is critical, and measuring the speed and perhaps to a certain extent the agility of moving to the cloud is really critical. But as organizations go through this transformation, are there metrics that they should be looking at that are different from the metrics that they were looking at perhaps when they were doing things on premise? And in your mind, what are some of those things that you would recommend that they should be looking at?
Well, the main metrics that we use, frankly, is, and depending on the size and maturity of your organization, one of the things, and it's non-technical, but I think as leaders, we have to be mindful of this. When you move to the cloud, you pay for cycles, you pay for usage, you pay for consumption. When you're on premise, you buy and capitalize hardware and you pay for maintenance. So the financial model is completely different. And when you start talking about charging and payments. As a technology executive, whether it's security or not, you have to understand that the only way that you can have those conversations about what the right financial model is and budgeting model is with consumption data. So that's a really, really key one. I also think that I mentioned a little bit about it before, but a change history, whether it's governed appropriately or not, is important. You know, what the old tripwire companies and things like that used to do. So managing and understanding how many changes there are from a metrics perspective is really, really important as well. And the last metric that I know that we use quite readily internally is that whole, during the migration period, what's the quote unquote cloud migration path? What are the primary inhibitors of cloud migration? How long is it taking? So you can start to identify potential bottlenecks that you could address for future workload migration. So whether it's a database version or some sort of relational database incompatibility is a pretty popular one. Having those metrics available on some of the key platforms is important as well.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Mike. And thank you so much for answering all the questions. Now, as we kind of wrap up, I'd love to hear from you today, a little bit more insight around multi-cloud, because I'm sure a lot of our audience members are probably thinking about this as well, and we haven't really touched on this. But one of the key elements that I've read, and pick your favorite analyst, to be honest, Mike, I'm sure you'll agree with me, but the majority of the analysts out there will say that the majority of organizations typically are typically about 80 to 90% multi-cloud. They use not one but multiple cloud environments in itself. From your perspective, what are some of the pros and cons of going multi-cloud? And I guess this kind of stems from some of the learnings perhaps that you can share that you have seen as Takeda has moved to that type of an environment. Where do you see are some of the pros and cons to that multi-cloud environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. It is an interesting challenge. Transparently, Takeda right now has one primary partner that we're using and generally speaking, focusing our energy on from a prioritization perspective. But we also recognize that there's no way that we'll have 100% uniformity, especially with the way that our business operates from a partnership perspective. We have a very, very open ecosystem of R&D partners, many of which use different cloud partners. So interfacing at the data layer is very, very important, and interfacing at the data movement capabilities is very, very important. I would say one of the challenges is understanding generally speaking, something like an AWS native tool, for example, may end up being quicker than and potentially operate at a deeper level, but it's obviously not very transplantable if you're doing some of those other cloud partners I talked about. So I think that understanding, and this is where frankly partners like Palo Alto come in, is that Palo Alto does provide a level of universal coverage that could help you with a multi-cloud environment, which is of course important. And I would say that the only other thing that I would advise is think about, broadly speaking, maybe products and services that you use that, whether you know it or not, find out what cloud they're using. So anybody who, for example, anybody who's really, really big on AWS or Google Cloud, GCP, and those are both great choices, but you also run Microsoft 365, whether you like it or not, you're an Azure customer as well. So there's also recognizing that there's a lot of services, and I know we in the biopharmaceutical space do a lot of high-end data analytics and data modeling, which is all running on GCP. So the entire business ecosystem is going to, so I do think that it's important to pick at least one to focus your internal skills energy on, but make sure your processes and your capabilities support appropriate interfaces across multiple environments.
Yeah, and completely agree with you there, Mike. And one of the things that I see in most cases as organizations move to multi-cloud isn't so much the logistical challenges; it's also the cybersecurity challenges. A lot of people, it's one of the big cons, in fact, that they talk about is the fact that as I move multi-cloud, I don't have the ability of porting sort of one policy or one single pane of glass when it comes to cybersecurity policy. And so cloud native security, unfortunately, doesn't always work in that environment. And what you really need is a platform that you can move towards as you move to a multi-cloud environment. That's obviously really critical. Mike, I've really appreciated speaking with you today. Thank you so much for your time and the energy and the amount of insight that you've provided. Best of luck to you. And again, we would love to have you back on and really share with us some of the other insights that you've seen as you go through the cloud transformation journey and perhaps other transformations that I'm sure Takeda is focused on as well. So thanks again for doing that. And again, I encourage anyone who's listening, if you haven't yet downloaded the free ebook called Navigating the Digital Age, where Mike's chapter, of course, is featured, and it is a fantastic read. Please visit the link that we're providing in below, and get yours today and download that. And again, we'd love to hear from you. If you have other insights, by all means, please do share that with us as well in the future. Thank you again, and we're wishing everybody here a great day.